Hello, welcome. This is Camden, Arkansas First United Methodist Church Sunday School, and I'm Ellen Horseman. We're beginning a book now called The Passion Play. This is, let me give you its full title with its subtitle. The Passion Play, Living the Story of Christ's Last Days, and it's by a United Methodist pastor called Reverend Rob Fuquay. So, this book is inspired, as it says in littler print, by the Oberammergau Passion. I sure don't know how to pronounce that name, but the Passion Play in Oberammergau, which is a small Bavarian village in Germany. Now, that play is the oldest continuing Passion Play, or the longest running Passion Play in the world, and the only one with a vow connected to it. It began its first performance back in 1634, and it's the only Passion Play that's connected to a vow, which I might have just said. Anyway, so the very first chapter, Reverend Rob Fuquay talks about the power of a vow. Now, we do, I guess whenever I hear the word vows, I always think of marriage vows, but we don't stop sometimes to think that our lives are very much defined by vows. For many of us, we had parents who married, who made vows to each other, and as a result of that, they had children, one of whom you would be. Then they may have had you baptized in a church, at which point they took a vow to nurture you in the faith. You may have taken your own marriage vows. You may have taken vows in the church to nurture and raise your children. As a member of the United Methodist Church, every time a person becomes a member of that church or is baptized, we as members make vows to support those people. So vows are a big part of our life. It's just that I don't think we very often think about how our lives are affected by the vows that others made before us, by the vows that our parents made, or vows that were made by ancestors that precede our parents, our forebearers. What kind of vows did they make, and what kind of effect do they have on your life today? Even maybe the country in which you live, or the region of the country in which you live. Like I said, we don't often think about how our own lives are affected, not only by the vows we make, but by the vows that other people have made. So I want to read a story with a vow in it from 1 Samuel. We're going to look at the very first chapter of 1 Samuel. And it begins telling us about a man whose name, who lived, I'll get this out in just a minute, a man named Elkanah, and he had a wife named Hannah. Now, he actually had two wives, and one of the two wives was able to bear children, but Hannah had none. And every year they would go up to the town nearby to leave their worship and sacrifice. Okay, so let me get to the part I was going to read before I flub myself right out of existence here. Beginning in verse 9, we read that one time after eating and drinking in Shiloh, so that's where they would go to take their offering and to pray to the Lord. Anyway, after eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah got up and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting in the chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. Hannah was very upset, and she couldn't stop crying as she prayed to the Lord. And then she made this promise. Lord of heavenly forces, just look at your servant's pain and remember me. Don't forget your servant. Give her a boy. Then I'll give him to the Lord for his entire life. No razor will ever touch his head. So I'm going to stop for a minute, and I could have maybe started a little bit earlier in this story. Of course, Hannah went for years without having any children. And for a woman in that day, to have children was her main mission in life, but it also was her financial security, because if a woman's husband died, women weren't allowed to work. So unless she had a father to take her back in, she was dependent on her male sons, and she had none. And her husband would ask her all the time why she was crying and wasn't he enough for her. But no, she longed to have children. But listen to the vow, to the promise that she makes to the Lord, that if he will if he will remember her and give her a boy, then I will give him to the Lord for his entire life. She's going to take that son, if she gets it, and give him to the Lord. And as she goes on in this story, she goes on praying, and I guess she's kind of just like moving her mouth or something, and Eli, the priest, is watching her and thinks she's drunk. But she tells him that she's not, and tells him that she's been praying, and he tells her to go in peace. Well, the story goes on in verse 20, that in the course of time the Lord remembered her, and Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, which means, I asked the Lord for him. So when her husband, Elinkei, and all his household went up to make the annual sacrifice and keep the solemn promise, Hannah didn't go. She said, I'll bring the boy when he is weaned, so that he can be presented to the Lord and stay there permanently. I will offer him as a Nazirite forever. Well, do what seems best to you, said her husband, Elinkei. Stay here until you've weaned him. But may the Lord bring to pass what you've promised. And so the woman stayed home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. When he had been weaned and was still very young, Hannah took him along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a jar of wine, and brought him to the Lord's house at Shiloh. They slaughtered the bull, then brought the boy to Eli. Excuse me, sir, Hannah said. As surely as you live, sir, I am the woman who stood here next to you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this boy, and the Lord gave me what I asked from him. So now I give this boy back to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. And then they worship there before the Lord. Of course, what follows in the text is a beautiful song by Hannah. And really, I guess the only other reference to Hannah is later on we'll be reading about the boy, and we'll learn that his mother makes him a new robe every year. So she stayed connected to his life, but she made this powerful vow, and she honored it. She had that son, and then she gave her son back. She was serious about her vow, and so she gave her longed-for child, she gave him her firstborn, and at that point her only child, to the Lord. Now the Lord would bless her later on, and she would end up having 3 more sons and I think it was 2 daughters. Well, so speaking of vows and connecting it to our book, which is about the Passion Play, the people of the village of Oberammergau, they also are affected by a vow. These people and their whole life and their village life is affected by a vow that was made by the villagers in Oberammergau almost 400 years ago. Every 10 years, usually the first year of a new decade, this town, which has about 5,000 residents in it, welcomes more than 500,000 people from throughout the world for its Passion Play performances, which are given from May through October. Now, this is a totally amateur production. It is put on by the people of Oberammergau. The play will be performed about 100 times between May and October. Each play, or the day of the play runs for 6 hours with a meal break in the middle of it. And the theater that they've built for this play seats 5,000 people. I want you to hear that. It seats 5,000 people in a town of 5,000 people. So you can see they're pretty busy. The play is produced and supported completely by local residents. To be a member of the cast, a person has to have been born in Oberammergau, or has to have lived there for 20 years, or has to have lived there for 10 years if they are married to a local Oberammergau resident, someone who was born there. So you're either born there, you married in, and you stayed for at least 10 years, or you've lived there for 20 years in order to be a member of the cast. It takes more than 2,000 people, in other words, about 40% of the town, to stage the play with the cast and all the elements of the production. Every hotel is full, and so other local people have to be involved. The hotels fill up, people have to open their homes to some of the people coming in from around the world. They have buses, but then a lot of local people run shuttle buses, run vans, anything to get people around. All of the local restaurants in the whole town combined cannot possibly serve the large crowds during that meal break, and so members of the village open up their homes and let people come in and eat. So this community goes all out. And of course, you can imagine that it's not just the year of the production, because they have to spend quite some time getting ready for it. Their whole life revolves around that. It defines who they are. And so all of this goes back to a vow that was made in 1633. After 84 residents of the town or the village, I guess you would call it, at that point had about 600 residents. So that's a pretty large amount. 84 of the 600 residents had died from the plague. The people vowed at a prayer meeting that every 10 years the devout representation of the suffering and death of Christ should be given, so that God would have mercy and free our village from this appalling sickness. The story goes that from that moment on, there were no more deaths from the plague. Now, there's some question about that, disputes about that. Some people think, well, when they look at the death records, there were no more deaths after July, and the vow is frequently said to have been made in October. So it's not really clear whether they made the vow before the deaths ended. Of course, even though there had been a little span from July to October, I don't think they could have thought, oh, the plague is over with. But it's not clear if they made this in the midst of the plague or shortly thereafter, remembering earlier commitments they had made. So was this a bargain, or was it a vow of thanksgiving? You know, sometimes we make vows in moments of high anxiety when everything is going wrong, and we're sort of like, God, if you could just get me out of this, I promise I will do this or I'll do that. And so I guess I have a question for you. Do these kinds of vows, like the vow that Hannah made because she was so desperate to have children, that if God would give her a son, then she would devote him to the Lord, or this vow that was made by these residents of Oberammergau to be delivered from the plague, and then they'd put on this plague. Does this seem like bargaining with God? It feels a little bit like it. You know, did Hannah bargain with God? Well, to begin with, as Reverend Fuquay reminds us, it is preposterous, he says, to think that we have anything God so desperately needs that we can force God to act on our behalf. When it comes to our relationship with God, we are the needy ones. So how are we to understand these vows? Well, what he suggests is this. For Hannah, the vow is not so much a bargain as a faithful promise made in advance of what she would do if God were to bless her. She's really stepping out in faith and saying, if I receive this blessing, I'm going to give it back to the Lord. And so Reverend Fuquay tells of a modern example. He spoke of a man named Royce Reynolds, who owned a dozen or more car dealerships in Greensboro, North Carolina, and who used his wealth to benefit local churches, local charities, global mission agencies, and many other programs. Now, he had grown up, as he described himself in a magazine article, Royce had grown up dirt poor. And at a very early point in his marriage and in his career, he wasn't doing very well. And he pulled his car over and he got down on his knees and he prayed. And he told the Lord that he needed a business partner, and that he needed a business partner that he could share his success with. And he vowed that he would give 10% of everything he made. Well, in a little bit, he began to sell more cars because he was a car salesman. And as soon as he did, he took a check for the tithe amount to his local pastor. And the pastor, who knew that Royce didn't have much money and he and his wife were struggling, he said, "Can you really afford this?" And Royce said, "I told him that he didn't understand. I have to pay off my partner. This is his share." That's a lovely attitude, isn't it? Well, over the years, Royce was more and more successful, and he has gone on to give away millions of dollars, and he credits everything he has to God. Reverend Fuquay says that Royce didn't bargain with God. He just made God a promise of what he would do if God should bless him. And isn't that what a vow is, after all? Promising what we will do in advance. Well, the people of Oberammergau made a similar promise in advance. Fuquay says that they made a vow that they had no possibility of fulfilling unless God intervened. Now think about that for a minute. If this plague was still going on, or even if it had only temporarily halted, these people had no way of knowing if they would survive. But they made a vow that every 10 years we're going to put on this passion play. So this was something that was totally dependent upon God. They made a promise not only that they would perform the passion play, but that it would be performed for the generations to come. I'd love to see their face if they could see how it is still going on all these years later. This is a vow that was definitely fulfilled. You know, a lot of times we were talking about earlier that sometimes we make a vow to God, and sometimes we do that rather in a trivial way, or we're quick to forget. The crisis is past, and then we might forget about our vow. Now, as Reverend Fuquay points out, that's not a salvation issue. God doesn't give grace or withhold grace based on whether we made a vow or kept the vow or not. What he says is our vows are not a prerequisite to grace, but a response to it. God loves us even when we don't live up to our vows. Now, that doesn't mean we should just slough them off, but what it means is we can accept God's forgiveness, and if we've made a vow, it's never too late to begin to fulfill that vow. But we certainly don't need to let our fear of God affect our willingness to make promises. And of course, the Reverend Fuquay gives another example. You know, he said that every year when his church has a pledge drive, and they talk about the vows that the people of the church have already made, and they have a pledge drive, and they ask people to anticipate how much they would be able to give that year. And he said he always has some people that will not sign a pledge card. And they say, well, you know, what if I have an emergency and I can't fulfill my pledge? I mean, my vow to God's a serious thing, so I'm not going to make that vow. I'll just be faithful with what I have. Now, Fuquay has kind of a cute way of addressing that. He said, what would it mean if we stood at the altar and said the same thing to our spouse? Well, I'll be faithful with what I have. I'll do my best, instead of saying I do and I will. Well, Ellen wants to add that if you have joined the United Methodist Church, you've already made vows. In addition to the vows that are part of your baptism and that you repeat when you're confirmed, your vows, among other things, to put your whole trust in Jesus Christ and to serve him as your Lord, you also made a vow when you joined your local congregation to faithfully participate in its ministries by your prayers, your presence, your gifts, and your service. Now, if that sounds familiar to a United Methodist, it's because I'm reading it right out of the service that's in our hymnal. That I vow as a member of this congregation to faithfully participate in its ministries by my prayers, my presence, my gifts, and my service. So you've already made that vow before you fill out a pledge card. You've already made a vow that you're going to give of your gifts, that you're going to give of your service, that you're going to give of your prayers and your presence, being physically present. And we also, and I think I mentioned this earlier, we make vows every time we bring a child into the church to be baptized. If we're the parents, we vow to nurture that child in the faith, to raise that child up in the faith. And we as a congregation vow that we will support that child and help that child and everyone else who joins our church in their faith journey. We have some responsibility because we've already made a vow. Our vows to God, friends, come out of our love and gratitude for what God has done. And with the recognition that without God, we wouldn't even have anything to vow. We would have nothing. Our vows give us a sense of something to live up to, a sense of purpose. And they can have far-reaching consequences. Now, I was saying earlier on that we don't always think about how the vows that others have made, like our parents and their parents before them, how those have affected our lives. And I'm not sure we're always seriously thinking about how our own vows affect people's lives. Again, a story from Reverend Fuquay. He tells about that one of his daughters started a literacy development program that was for at-risk children. And at the end of the first year, the pilot program year, they had a little celebration, and the kids came, and some that had been helped, and some spoke, and some sang about how this literacy program had helped them. And he said that one of their friends came up and told him, boy, you must be really, it must make you really good to see what you've had a part in. And Reverend Fuquay said, my wife and I told him, well, we didn't do this. This was all our daughter. She did it herself. But this is what their friend said. He said, oh, no. He said, I want you to hear me out. You and Susan made a vow at an altar, and as a result, your daughter was born. Plus, you vowed to raise and nurture her in the faith when she was baptized. Don't you think God used that nurturing to guide her to do what... Hang on just a second. Okay, I'm sorry, I got distracted by something locally, so let me get back to what I was saying. Their friend was telling them that they had taken a vow and got married and had the daughter, and then you vowed to raise and nurture her in the faith when she was baptized. And he said, don't you think God used that nurturing to guide her into doing what she's doing? Fuquay says, well, I still wasn't prepared to take any credit, but there was an idea in this person's words that I couldn't debate. God takes our vows and does more with them than we can know or sometimes foresee. That makes me think that when we do make a vow, including that vow to nurture our children, including that vow as a congregation to nurture our children, we need to remember to make that a commitment. And where we've messed up and haven't done it, then let's recommit. Let's remember what we've promised God. These are serious, but the wonderful thing about it is that God can take our vow, and as the Reverend Fuquay says, he can do more with our vow than we can know or sometimes foresee. He goes on to say, when the villagers of Oberammergau made a vow in 1633, they were most likely thinking of their own commitment. Surely they had no way of knowing how a prayer meeting one night would shape the lives of generations to come. Vows have that kind of power. God uses the promises people make to impact others far beyond the knowing and even the intention of the promise makers. That's kind of an awesome thought. So God can He can take our vows and do far more with them than we can know or sometimes foresee. Thanks be to God for the grace that He gives us, for the way that He loves us, for the way that He forgives us when we don't keep our vows, and for the way that He strengthens us and gives us purpose in those vows that we make. My friends, I hope that God will be with you all of this week, and we will meet again next week for the second chapter in this book. Bye-bye now.